Okay, so number 5 and 2.2 is a shitty question. So the reason it's a shitty question is your book says, find the range of the given function f on the domain given. So they're looking at this and they're saying, okay, there's this function, right? That's f. Totally down with that. F can be whatever, right? And then they're saying, this thing's the domain of f, right? And they're asking, what's the range? And they want me to use some kind of graph to figure this out, right? So I could get a graph from a lot of places, calculator, Wolfram Alpha, or I could graph some points by hand and maybe figure it out. Or I could know what this thing looks like and then figure it out. The reason I'm complaining about this question is what?
Two asymptotes in it.
This has a vertical asymptote in it, and that asymptote happens where and why? Like, why am I saying that there's an asymptote?
Because it happens at 0, because you can't divide by 0.
Good. This thing allows for division by a variable, right? Specifically x. If x is 0, this thing is dorked, right? I don't know how to divide by 0. But they told me that domain includes 0. You guys see that?
Yeah.
That's just
So, yeah.
idiotic.
I didn't catch that.
Right? That's pure oversight on their part. They should have said, this is not the domain. The domain is -2 is less than, x is less than 2, and x isn't 0.
Yeah.
You guys see that? Or they could have written this out in interval notation as -2 up to 0, union 0 up to 2. Those aren't quite the same. Why not? What did I screw up?
Because they still,
Brackets?
yeah, they still,
I don't want to include 0, right? But the 2's need to be included. You guys see that? Okay, so let me pull out my handy dandy graph of what 1 over x looks like in my head. You guys have a graph of what 1 over x looks like in your head? No? Okay, maybe let's develop one then. So let me make a table of x's and 1 over x's. This is usually the naive approach to making a graph if you don't know what they look like. So what are your 5 favorite points?
2,
-2,
6,
4,
1,
1,
0,
0,
1.
1.
If you're not going to put anything on.
Okay, so these are my 5 favorite x values. Why are these my 5 favorite x values?
Because they're
Because
independent.
it's tiny.
Because they're small and
I
integers.
thought you just said x can't equal 0.
Good. Okay, so really I should be striking that line from my table, right? The input 0 can't go anywhere. So if I'm going to graph that, I really should be thinking about there's a problem here. You guys see that? Don't get to, like when I try to connect the dots here, I don't get to cross that thing. So how about these other guys? What's 1 over 2? 1 over 2. Don't think too hard. What's 1 over -2? Negative 1 over 2. What's 1 over -1? -1, and 1 over 1 is 1. Okay, so far if I draw those points, I've got out 2, up a half. And that's as far out as I'm allowed to go, right? Because they restricted the domain. So I'm going to leave everything over there off. And if I go back -2, I go down a half. And I have to leave that stuff off. Okay, -1 goes to -1, so that's down here. 1 goes to 1, so that's up here.
That's weird.
And you just approach your asymptote.
Yeah, and remember, you're not allowed to, this is an asymptote, right? So I don't get to cross that thing to connect the dots. And so really over here, I only have 2 dots to try to connect, right? Let me get a couple more dots, maybe. So what else are what are other interesting values that I should try to add to my table here?
A half and negative a half.
Okay. Right, I'm resorting to things that aren't my 5 favorites because, well, I used those and they didn't help that much. So what's 1 over 1/2? 2. Okay, so that goes up here. And 1 over negative 1/2 is negative 2. Okay, so at this point I could probably notice that this picture's symmetrical, right? You guys see that? So maybe I could give up on one of these and think about, okay, so what happens as I get closer to 0? If I take a little number and divide 1 by it, what do I get? In other words, what's this? 1 over little is big. Right? One thing split among fractions of people is lots of shares. Okay, so these are going to get bigger, yeah? And they're going to 1 divided by 0, yeah? So they're going to get big without bound. So if I'm going to try to connect this, I think I need something like this. Oops. I'm just got to make sure I pass the vertical line test, right? And this side,
Same thing,
same thing flipped over, right? Boom. Okay, so there's my graph. What's the range? How do I figure out the range for my graph?
Is it y values?
Yeah, it's the y values. So what are the possible y values here? So I need to take this picture and smush, right? So if I take that picture and smush onto the y-axis, right, I get, I think, stuff starting here and going up, and stuff starting there and going down.
What were those points right there on the?
Yeah, good. So what's the closest this thing gets to 0 on the positive side? Like, what's the lowest point here? Can't remember. So that was 2, right?
Yeah.
So this point here is 2 comma 1/2, yeah?
Yeah.
So the lowest this thing ever gets is,
One.
well, the lowest this ever gets, while it's still positive, is the half.
Yeah. And then the other side of it.
And the other side will be negative a half. Oops. What am I doing wrong here?
You put that in the wrong spot.
Yeah. Negative a half is not an input, it's an output.
Yep.
And the input that goes with it is negative 2. So how do I write my interval here? How do I write my range? So the range is,
Negative infinity to.
good, start on the bottom, right? So negative infinity up to
And then
negative a half. And then, and also
Two.
1/2, right? Just the y's. I don't care which x's gave me that, just that some x did.
Yeah.
Up to infinity. Now I need to decide on brackets.
Brackets near the numbers, parentheses near things that can't happen.
Okay, parentheses on infinities because they can't happen, and y brackets here
Because
Because
it
it's
goes
included.
with stuff.
because those are in fact included, right? -1 is in the, or negative 1/2 is in the range because the input -2 gets you there. And similarly with 1/2. That's cool. What's that? How are you raising?
Isn't, yeah, I guess so. Isn't y approaching 0 on the bottom in both ways? So
Isn't y
But your
On the
domain
halves.
cuts it off, so it doesn't matter.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, you're right. I forgot about that. They gave you the domain. I was asking if they didn't give you the domain, the y is
Oh,
also
yeah.
approaching 0.
Yeah, so if they hadn't said this domain restriction,
Yeah.
right, if they hadn't said x's are limited to between -2 and 2,
Yeah, it's-
yeah, then I'd be getting everything except 0.
Right. Yeah.
in both.
I just forgot that you gave the domain.
Well, yeah, exactly. I'd have negative infinity up to 0, open, union, open 0 up to positive infinity. You guys cool with that?
Can you put a limit in this?
Can I put a what?
A limit?
A what?
Zero.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
That's
on,
zero.
on this one, that's probably a bit problematic. We should talk, let's talk about limits after we're comfy with this stuff. You guys cool? That really is, oh, okay, well, let's talk about it anyway, fine. So that's kind of what's going on here, right? If I think about sending x, so, let me say, all right, I'm going to take f, right? And on f, I'm going to talk about sending x's to 0 from the positive side. So that's me thinking about, I'm going to push in from over here. What do the values do? If you think about coming in this way, what do the outputs do? Yeah, they get really, really big, right? What's a math word for really, really big? Probably infinity. Yeah, I think that's reasonable. That's really what we'd write here. And the reason we kind of write that is we'd say, okay, so if I put an x that's really close to 0 but positive in here, right? That's really this thought I was doing. You guys see that? I kind of cheated a little bit. I really was doing a limit here. Why am I not saying just going to 0, period? Yeah, if I just said going to 0, right, I'd be wanting to talk about on both sides of 0. And some of those things are really big and positive, right? And some of them over here are really big and negative. Yeah, they're on opposite sides, right? So that would probably be a problem saying this actually equaled anything.